The Industrial Revolution ensured geopolitical dominance for the countries that led it for a very long time. Which countries will benefit the most from the digital revolution? How will the global balance of power shift in the military, political, and economic domains? What does a world with two technospheres around the USA and China mean to key players such as Germany, Japan, and Brazil? As geographical distances decrease due to digitalization, the WTO says one thing is certain. More attention will be paid to regions like Africa, Asia, and Latin America. How might digitalization shift the current geopolitical landscape in the future? Digital revolution, resetting global power politics?
The first panel is tackling the question, does the digital revolution reset global power politics, like the Industrial Revolution did 150 years ago? It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists, who will each offer a 10-minute glimpse into the topic from his or her own perspectives. The US, Europe, Africa, and Latin America are represented. Let me start with Laura Rosenberger from the US. Laura is the director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy of the German Marshall Fund and well-versed in the US point of view, also from her long time at the US State Department and White House. Uri Rosenthal to her left, esteemed political scientist and practitioner, 3 years Foreign Minister of the Netherlands, co-founder of the Freedom Online Coalition that brings 30 states together in protecting human rights in the internet. Uri will offer us the European perspective on our topic. Then Nanjala Nyabola from Nairobi, writer and political analyst, author of the book Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, about how digitization changes politics in Kenya, former Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. Last but not least, Oliver Della Costa Stünkel, born in Düsseldorf but now coming from Brazil, professor for international relations in Sao Paulo, author for El País and other news outlets, and fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute. Before you start your keynotes, allow me to set the scene. For the last 70 years, the insignia of a major power were a seat on the UN Security Council and the possession of intercontinental ballistic missiles. If you had neither, economic success could stand in as a power factor, or when all else failed, the attractiveness of your state or societal model. The last decade has added a new type of power factor, a digital one. It is a truism that digitization changes everything, but I believe that we can only imagine the tip of the iceberg of what digitization will change in the long run. This is a vast field, so for the sake of focusing our discussion, we have sent the panelists a number of guiding questions. Of these, I have picked out 3, and I hope that your keynotes, as well as our discussion afterwards, will bring us a little closer to answering them. The first question is, how will digitization impact the current power balance? For example, will the possession of conventional armed forces and nuclear capabilities still have the same relevance in times of cyber warfare and autonomous weapon systems? Will new instruments of warfare strengthen states with good IT capacities such as India, Latin America, or Eastern European countries? And will future wars be fueled by new strategically relevant resources in the tech realm instead of oil? Second question, will digitization increase global inequalities? The WTO forecasts that the world economy will grow until 2030 while a third due to technological advances such as 3D printing, automated driving, and AI. Will the economic divide between first and third world open up even further? Or will digitization expand international value chains and enhance chances for a more evenly spread global development? The answers to these questions will have a great impact on our security as well. Third and last question, how do we handle a world where geographical distance has less and less meaning? On the one side, this is good news already today. Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia feel much closer than 10 years ago, but it has a downside too. Any trend can turn global in no time. Nothing can be contained effectively. This also affects our foreign and security policy. These remarks lie at the heart, at the center of our debate. Now I would like to invite Laura Rosenberger to take the floor. Thank you very much, Laura.
Well, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be with all of you this morning, and I really look forward to the conversation we're going to have on this panel. Sorry, just adjusting the mics here. I think, as we just heard, I think digitization is changing everything. But I also think it's coming at a time of other changes happening in the world. And it's acting both as an accelerator to those changes and one that is actually being shaped by them. So as I look out at the global trends that we're seeing around the world, digitization and technological change is one of them. The other change I see is declining democracies, democratic recession in parts of the world, places where we felt democracy was on the ascent or had been solidly established, but where we see democratic backsliding occurring. And that's happening at the same time that we are seeing authoritarian regimes around the world exercising growing power. That's particularly, I think, the case with Beijing, but we see this from other authoritarian actors as well. And so I think the way that these two trends are converging and the way they interact with one another is one of the things that I'm paying particular attention to, because I think they will shape the domains of global competition and conflict over the next several decades and will define the geopolitical forces that are shaping power. In fact, as we've heard, these technologies have implications for how power is exercised itself, and I believe they have implications for where conflict is going to be carried out. Now, there's a lot of talk about autonomous weapon systems and how technology will be able to change and shape traditional military conflict or kinetic conflict. But I also think that these technological changes are going to have implications for creating new battlefields. In fact, I actually think that we are seeing conflict occurring in new domains, whether we recognize it as such. Indeed, both the Chinese Communist Party and Putin's Russia define the information domain as domains of conflict. They actually see cyber and information as integrated domain spaces for battle in a way that many democracies do not recognize. And in fact, in a way that democracies are challenged to understand the implications. These are areas where information control and the ability to manipulate information is something that inherently builds power. It is built into the way that authoritarian regimes are able to exercise power, and they are far more comfortable with doing so. But the flip side is that it creates real challenges for democracies to determine how, in fact, to both defend against and deter these kinds of activities when it is our very open and free conversations that are being targeted. This leads to a blurring of the line between what is war and what is peace, between civilian and military battle spaces. As one AI futurist has said, in the future, wars will be fought by code, not hand-to-hand combat. But I think the question is, have democracies recognized this battle that we are facing? Are we equipped to actually defend against and deter these kinds of competition and conflict? And to do so in a way that is affirming of democratic values and our way of life, that is affirming of human rights, and that holds those values at the center. We know that Vladimir Putin has said, quote, "Whoever becomes the leader in this space, being AI, will become the ruler of the world." And that Xi Jinping has emphasized artificial intelligence as a strategic technology and has emphasized the need to combine it with, quote, "social governance." Those lead to very different models of what technology does for society and what it does for governance. And I believe that the implication is that democracy has become a battlefield. This isn't just about democratic values because we believe in them. Of course it is, because we do believe in them. But it's also about interests. Our very democratic institutions are at stake in this struggle. And for me, the question is, as we are developing these new technologies, as we look to be able to harness the positive sides that we heard several of the opening speakers speak about, how can we ensure that these technologies are developed in a way that puts humans at the center, that put democratic values at the center, one that enables greater openness, greater opportunity, greater equality, rather than one that enables greater control, greater authoritarianism, and where machines are at the center. It really is a question of not just what does the future hold, but what kind of future do we want? And how do we, right now, take the steps necessary to shape the future in a positive direction? I think it means that we need to recognize that in addition to technological change, authoritarianism is a geopolitical force. It is one that is creating significant challenges for democracies and one that we need to rally against, one where we need to understand, in fact, the long-term implications. It's not just about 5G technology. It's not just about particular kinds of telecommunications infrastructure. We are seeing, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party and its proxies beginning to export technologies around the world that essentially create what I call techno-authoritarianism in a box. Huawei smart cities, for instance, include in many instances significant components of surveillance and population control. Many of these technologies send data back to entities that have connections with the Chinese Communist Party, helping them develop their own AI capabilities, perfecting them and growing their own capabilities, while providing greater capabilities to governments around the world that enable control and manipulation of populations at scale. This is fundamentally a way that the Chinese Communist Party is exercising power. And I don't believe that we yet have come to the realization of how technology is, in fact, leading to different ways of exercising power. It's why things like standard-setting bodies that may sound very arcane for many foreign policy types are actually incredibly important in setting norms and rules for how these technologies are going to be used in the future, for what, in fact, they are going to look like. We need to recognize these new ways that power is being exercised. And I completely agree with the foreign minister that what this requires is multilateral solutions. I completely agree that we need to find a new way between the ultra-libertarian and the Chinese authoritarian model. And I think that, in fact, we can do that. It's going to require a new kind of long-term thinking. It's going to require democracies coming together to understand how we can create rules and frameworks that continue to put democratic values at the center, while ensuring that we have appropriate regulation and control in place for technologies that can have a potentially destructive impact on our societies. In fact, I do actually think that Europe is leading in many ways on this front. GDPR is a really important example of a space where Europe has taken the lead and is providing a model for others to potentially follow. But I also think we need to do more to update our institutions to reflect these changes. As we heard, of course, at one point, the UN Security Council and having a seat on it was really the way to exercise power. That doesn't quite seem to be the case anymore. And I think this has implications not just for multilateral institutions more broadly, but for our governments specifically. Have we oriented our governments to harness both the potential of these technologies, understand their implications in the immediate and long term, be able to work with civil society in the important ways that are going to be increasingly necessary, and to bridge the divides between the public and private sector? Now, I'm quite mindful, coming from the United States, that the rift between Washington and Silicon Valley and that views in Europe on Silicon Valley are not particularly positive. And I think that the United States has a particular responsibility in this sense to bridge the divide between the public and private sectors, and to put in place smart regulation that allows for innovation to continue, because we have to compete. But we also need to ensure that that regulation is ensuring that these technologies develop in a way that affirms the future that we want to see. It means we do need to rethink how we are spending on our militaries. Now, I'm a national security person, so I'm of the belief that we need to, in fact, continue to spend on our militaries. We need to be able to defend against and deter conventional and strategic threats. But we also need to recognize these new battle spaces and ensure that we have the capabilities in those domains to defend against and deter competition and conflict there. That means very different kind of investments. In many instances, it means investing in innovation and competition at home. It means investing in our people. It means ensuring that those investments are actually giving opportunity and building greater equality. And I also think it means we need to reinvest in other institutions, like our foreign ministries. As a former diplomat, I feel very strongly about ensuring that we have highly skilled diplomats who are able to deal with the world as it changes and to help shape the future. We need to make sure that we are equipping our diplomats for 21st century challenges. Finally, I think that it means in this time of change, we need to start with our friends and our allies. And quite candidly, this is something that I don't see my government doing enough of in this moment. And I think we face an opportunity in time right now. It is urgent that we come together to work on these challenges, and I hope that we will seize that opportunity. Thank you very much.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, excellent program. Thank you for that. Incisive questions, pertinent questions. Let me be brief and say right beforehand that when we talk cyber politics and cyber diplomacy, ladies and gentlemen, we do talk global power politics. And let's face it, in May this year, so this month, actually for the first time, we saw cyber attacks being countered in the world by physical attack on cyber infrastructure. Cyber attacks of Hamas against Israeli critical infrastructure were countered by Israeli air forces and destroying Hamas hacking headquarters. So that is just a new point in this realm. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been in this field of cyber politics since 2010, and in those days it was still the rosy idea of the initial urhebers of ICT and internet, who were actually the heroes of New Horizons and all-in democracy. The phrase in those days still was, internet is of all of us. And on the civil side, security, not on the military side, but on the civilian side, security wasn't on the top of their minds. And in those days, governments indeed were the black sheep. On the governmental side, this actually gave way to increasing concerns about cybercrime and the online potential of free flow of information in closed societies, Arab Spring, etc. Then we have been engaged in the so-called London process, the global conference on cyberspace, where we try to strike a balance between, on the one hand, a free and open internet and security considerations, and of course the other point which is so important not to forget, social development and economic growth. The Freedom Online Coalition, which was initiated by me and Hillary Clinton in 2011, brought together 30 governments which were convinced that we should really emphasize the need for this free and open internet, for human rights to be applied also in the cyberspace, and for international law to be not only for the offline but also for the online matters. And indeed, we already then saw embattled NGOs which were trying their access to the open internet, but were being foreclosed in many ways. Today, concerns do not bear only upon the states and their proxies, but they indeed bear also, as it has already been mentioned by Minister Maas and by the first speaker in this panel, it's also about the private corporations and their practices and sometimes malpractices. The picture right today in the world is as follows. When we take the big players, Russia, President Putin has pushed through the Russian internet law, claiming own root and own domain name systems. Interestingly enough, he has offered it by now to the others in the BRICS constellation, where especially Brazil and India are of course key players, which are now in a transitional kind of sphere between the notion of an open and free internet and the threats concerned. When you really narrow down the Russian internet law, it is all about what is sometimes called the threatening development from an open global internet to a splinternet, to the nationalization of the internet. A very bad future it would be indeed. China confronted with serious questions about their own global players in the cyberspace and in the digital economy. It has already been addressed. Huawei, and also others, you know, it is quite a puzzle. And I would only remember you that still in the Obama administration, the US and China came to some sort of an agreement on really countering espionage and hacking intellectual property. I would say that this agreement seems not to hold that well. Third, the US administration, hardball politics and hardball trade deal-making. And let's face it too, when we talk malpractices, it's not just on the Chinese side, but maybe also elsewhere in the world. And last but not least, the South, the global South. We see tremendous developments there. On the one hand, we see inequality and indeed a digital divide. But at the same time, we see remarkable examples in the South, in the digital South, of what we call leapfrogging. E-finance and Internet of Things taking a tremendous progress in some parts of the South. And there, of course, we are in an interconnected world where the new gadgets, also of the Internet of Things, should indeed be based on a firm infrastructure, not the least
a firm legal infrastructure. Now the EU, Europe, it's often said in a triad, the US innovates, China replicates, the EU regulates. Yes, the US innovates. Yes, China replicates, but it is going quickly beyond that. And the EU indeed regulates, and I would say it's very good that it regulates in many ways. It has already been mentioned, the GDPR. I would also add to this the European Cybersecurity Act, which is very important, giving the agency, ENISA, a stronger mandate and going for certification frameworks. In April 19, the European Parliament actually amended the European Cybersecurity Act effectively to insert a duty for states as well as non-state actors to protect the public core of the internet from infringements. And talking public core, we talk domain name systems, IP addresses, protocols, servers, cables, satellites. Let me say that this is not just for nothing. In January 19, this year, Sweden had to cope with an attack directly on its domain name system and root servers. And by the way, I think it is very nice that the European Parliament indeed followed suit on the proposal of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, which I'm a member of, to come up with these sort of norms. Then, having been said, how should Europe, ladies and gentlemen, position itself and act upon the challenges in the global cyberspace? First and foremost, let's not give in to this. All efforts from the European side should be based on the unique common values of the European Union: human rights, honoring international law in cyberspace, stressing the need for an open and free internet, and also, of course, looking for the way to keep trust in the cyberspace. Second, it should insist on indeed high trust cyberspace, and this can only be achieved and guaranteed if the focus is on sustained cooperation within the EU, which is also mentioned, by the way, in the Cybersecurity Act, capacity building throughout Europe. And secondly, effective cooperation outside the EU. And there we can be on safe ground when we talk about capacity building together with the countries in the south. And I like to draw your attention to, for instance, the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, where really good projects are underway. Germany is a member, by the way, of this Global Forum. In this respect, and it has been mentioned by Minister Maas, it's of the greatest importance for the European Union to make use to the fullest possible of the leverage of civil society and to accept multi-stakeholder approach to cyberspace and the digital issues. Third, of course, the European Union should take a tough stance against states and non-state actors that are engaged in tampering practices in software production, states and non-state actors that really hamper the cyberspace by cyber malpractices vis-à-vis the electoral machinery, elections, referenda, plebiscites. And third, states and non-state actors. You see, it's always this twin that abuse ICT, social media for violence-prone and terrorist purposes. I refer here also to the very compelling Christchurch Declaration of a few weeks ago. And in this respect too, let's face it, from the European end, or rather, as the Brits would say, from the continental end, with Brexit being highly likely, we do lose, of course, a direct link to the Five Eyes intelligence community. 4, the EU should strengthen its critical raw material strategy and policies. Key raw materials, such as, for instance, lithium, but we have some 30 others in the inventory of the EU, which are indeed exclusive ingredients of ships, batteries, and other high-tech products. This point is really vital. At the moment, China has abundant resources, critical resources, does work on stockpiling and is indeed buying stakes in critical resources areas and plants elsewhere in the world, not the least Latin America, Mr. President. Yeah. Last point. The EU should be diligent in striking the balance between cybersecurity and cyber-connected economic growth, social development. And if the EU wants to keep up with the global players in cutting-edge technology like AI, R&D endeavors are of the utmost importance. That is my message today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Ooh, people haven't had their morning coffee. Good morning, everyone. As you've heard, my name is Nanjala, and I'm an independent researcher and a consultant based in Nairobi, Kenya. And I have the immense privilege of being independent, which means that I can say whatever I want and no one's going to fire me. Please do not invest more in the military. I am going to be speaking from the perspective, a very unusual perspective, I think, in conversations like this. I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of an ordinary citizen. And why do I say that this is an unusual perspective in meetings like this? Because for so long we assumed that the central referent object of foreign policy conversations must be the state, and must be the capacity of the state. And we tend to neglect the impact the decisions that are taken at the state level have on ordinary people, and how ordinary people experience the decisions that are made in rooms like this. So I'm going to be talking from the perspective of an ordinary African citizen who has to live in this emerging, evolving, and highly contested space. I have to caveat this by saying I hate talking about Africa in the aggregate. I think when you talk about 54 countries, thousands of nationalities, you tend to get a lot of important details lost. So if I give you the big picture analysis, I would say something like 70% of Africans are not connected to the internet. And you would go away thinking, well, that's 70% in each and every single one of those 54 countries, but that would be completely untrue. In fact, the statistics on internet connectivity in Africa are completely varied. You have extremes like Cape Verde, 58% of the population has access to the internet every day. You have countries like South Africa, where you have 56% of the population using the internet every day. And then you have countries like the Central African Republic, and you have countries like the Republic of Congo, where the statistics go down to 2019. I think the lowest percentage on the continent is about 11% of the population using the internet every day. So we're talking about a very varied territory that's having a very varied experience with the internet. And that is why my research focuses on one country. That is why I write about Kenya primarily, because it allows us to get into the reeds of what exactly is happening. Kenya represents a very interesting example of what analysts like to call leapfrogging. And I think it has all of the advantages, all of the benefits, all of the good things that we think about with the internet. As I said, leapfrogging, we're talking about a country where 83% literacy rate, 88% internet penetration rate, and please don't fault us on the mathematics, but according to the Communications Authority of Kenya, we have 112% mobile phone penetration. We're good at marathons, maths not so much. We're talking about a young generation of digital natives. 60% of Kenya's population is below the age of 35, a whole generation that has grown up that doesn't remember what the world was like before the internet. 78% of Kenyans who are connected to the internet are doing it on their mobile phones. So the mobile phone has really transformed how people are interacting using the internet, and the government has taken notice. We have massive investments in government digital presence. As we speak, we're in the middle of rolling out a program to e-register all the citizens in the country. It has its own problems. Right now, if you want to get a new passport, new driver's license, new car registration, everything, you have to use the internet to do that. What does that mean in practical terms as a citizen? What does it mean for people who don't? Only 12% of Kenyans have computers in their homes. What does that mean for the 88% of people? These are the uncomfortable questions that we're dealing with, beyond the glossy, high-level terms of leapfrogging and the massive investments that we're seeing in tech. What does it mean for ordinary people? We're also seeing the challenges. We're seeing the securitization of the internet space at an alarming rate. We're seeing predatory capital, external investments that are distorting how technology is rolled out in the country. The 2017 election is a great example of some of the phenomena we're talking about here. And I want to take a little bit of a side note here to say, when you sit in Europe, we hear a lot of fear of China, and China is going to do this, and China is going to do that. Let me speak to you as an African. We are equally afraid of both of you. Because the company that did the most mischief in the last Kenyan election was French. The companies that have received the most money from politicians to invest in distorting the social media conversation are American. The companies that are, and yes, 70% of the IT infrastructure in Kenya is built by Huawei, it is built by China, and so there is a concern definitely in that regard. But we're also seeing predatory capital from the US, from Europe, from other quote-unquote Western democracies that are distorting how the internet is affecting security, public life in Kenya and in other African countries. So, sitting as I do in this unique vantage point, what I see are three things that, going with the theme of this conference, how we are resetting power politics. We see a lot of potential. We see Kenya's the biggest sector of Kenya's economy, rather, is agriculture, by and large. But in the last year, we've seen 38 billion shillings, or $38 million, in investments in the tech sector, by far the largest in Africa. We've seen people who, living in a country that doesn't have natural resources, until recently, didn't have confirmed oil deposits, didn't have any kind of resource that would put it on the map in the traditional ways that we think about international politics, suddenly becoming a focal point for foreign direct investment, becoming a focal point for a new way of organizing developing economies. We are seeing a shift in the way citizens are engaging with their states, which is forcing a shift in the foreign policy in the region. We're seeing a country that is finally able to position itself at the center of these emerging discourses on how the internet is going to transform how we do politics on the continent. Young Kenyans speaking directly to the African Union, speaking directly to the East African community, and putting their issues on the agenda, thereby transforming how foreign policy is done in the region. The example that comes to mind, for example, is the Free Bobi Wine campaign, which was run primarily from Kenya, actually, speaking into Ugandan politics and demanding the release of a political prisoner who was running for office against the incumbent. This puts freedom on the agenda in the regional politics. This puts the needs and the demands of a young populace on the agenda in a region that hasn't necessarily responded to that in the past. So the three themes that I guess I would like to leave you with in terms of resetting power politics, and again, sitting in Africa, sort of looking at this conversation and being part of this conversation. Cybersecurity and the surveillance economy is something that we are extremely worried about as citizens. As I said, 70% of the ICT infrastructure that's being built in Africa is being built by China, by Huawei. But when I sit in rooms like this, I don't hear people saying, let's not build cybersecurity architecture. I hear people saying, let Europe build your cybersecurity architecture. And as a citizen, I don't want either. I really don't. Because what we're doing is we're creating systems where we're empowering administrations to clamp down on freedom, to clamp down on citizens, to punish people simply for dissenting against the mainstream opinion. There's been agreements between China and Zimbabwe to build facial recognition software that would make it easier for the Zimbabwean government to police Zimbabwean activists especially. The problem is we still haven't figured out how to get clean water into every single corner of Zimbabwe. So there's something there about how we're prioritizing, how this sexy new realm of conversation is shifting priorities in foreign policy in a way that is detrimental to us as ordinary citizens. We're seeing states investing a tremendous amount of money in surveillance, in ID technology. In Kenya right now, as I said, we're in the middle of this massive citizen registration drive that is going to cost an estimated 6 billion shillings, or 60 million US dollars. At the same time, we're still recovering from the impact of a devastating drought that left many people dead last year. What does this say about how this conversation is shifting agendas and distracting from other issues that should be equally important? I've alluded to this, so I'm not going to go into great detail because I see the timer flashing red. The second theme, Africa is a subject for conversation and not an object for foreign policy. We are talked about, we're not talked to. We are stuck in the middle of this great power conversation, but we, and especially we as citizens, our priorities are simply not in the room. We are an afterthought. And again, I want to underscore, as we're talking about China, we should pay attention also to Israel, which is also selling significant amounts of surveillance and policing technology to various African countries to hack into phones, computers, etc. We're talking about elections. Elections in Africa are big money today. There's a lot of money to be made in African elections. And companies all over the world have noticed that. When we talk about democracy and the values of democracy, and we talk about how protecting democratic interests, are we paying attention to how this intersects, how our money basically is being spent in shaping electoral behavior in different parts of the world? And that ties into my last point, which is the growing influence of private capital. As I said in the beginning, we tend to think of the state as the natural object of foreign policy analysis. And so here we're going to talk about the tension between the US and China, even though it's playing out as a trade war, as the influence of corporations. This presumption that all capital is good and all money-making ventures are good, regardless of what they do to the other side, in the other side of the world, is a dangerous presumption, and it does not hold water. I've alluded to this, so I'm just underscoring a very quick point. The biggest purveyors of these technological black boxes into which we put data and internet and connectivity and all of these jargon words, and on the other side comes out chaos, are private corporations. So are we thinking also, as we think about EU regulating, etc., are we expanding the conversation to include how are we going to address the multinational internet corporation that is housed in the United States, that is answerable to US to US shareholders, that is answerable to US legislators, that is causing a genocide in Myanmar? Are we thinking about these new connections and how we're going to reorganize around them? I'm going to stop there and leave you with this thought. Technology isn't going to do anything. We are going to do things. Technology is shaped by the people who build it and shaped by the people who use it. And so this ceding of power, this passive positioning whereby we're saying technology will, is the most dangerous thing that we can do. We are the ones who are going to do. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. That's a very hard act to follow, but I'll give my best. It's a great pleasure to be here. I very briefly want to speak about the Brazilian perspective with the same caveats that I think there's no way to give a Latin American perspective, such a diverse region here. But I'd like to focus in particular on the geopolitics of new technologies and how Brazil in particular reacts to the trade war and the growing tension between China and the United States, and how 5G has become sort of a symbol of how this will play out, and how I think today the tensions between the two major powers are shaping politics in a way that I think will change domestic politics in a way that the first question somebody asks about political analysts in Brazil today is how they stand on this particular issue that involves China and the United States, where actually our government is deeply divided. Our president traveled to the United States, is very much a supporter of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump told him, in addition to helping the United States on the crisis in Venezuela, what I really want you to do is limit Chinese influence in Latin America. This is something that you could do which would make Brazil a key ally of the United States. And then the vice president traveled to Beijing and I think heard something somewhat similar, but of course just the opposite. And the government is deeply divided, and I think that, I'd like to just briefly explain, I think China is winning this confrontation in Latin America because I think a lot of the strategy that we're seeing from the United States in particular, a lot of the arguments used may make a lot of sense in Europe and in the United States, but are actually counterproductive in a developing country. And I think a lot of the arguments we've just heard from the Kenyan perspective do apply to Latin America as well. And I think that was almost funny. Actually, we had a meeting with Trump representatives who said that Brazilians should consider when hiring Huawei to install the 5G network that Chinese spying was a real issue. Considering that in 2013, what derailed completely the bilateral relationship between Brazil and the United States was, of course, the NSA spying scandal. And Dilma Rousseff at the time canceled a state visit after not receiving a formal apology from the Obama administration. It, of course, doesn't help that mixed with this be careful with the Chinese, we see a return of the Monroe Doctrine, actually, which is now being officially supported by several of the leading Trump policy makers. So in that sense, I think there is a sense that these issues like Huawei and 5G are much more pawns in a broader war, and that countries in Latin America are sort of at the receiving end of that and must continue to play a game that they've actually played during the Cold War, which is to seek to somehow benefit from this confrontation, which actually some countries during the Cold War have done quite successfully. Another difference, of course, is that whereas in Germany, I think there are legitimate concerns about industrial secrets that, by using Chinese companies may be at risk. That's not really the case in the developing world, where industries sort of, possess much less industrial secrets. In that sense, many of these arguments, I think, are less of a concern than cost issues, for example. That of course, in a sense, I would expect most countries in Latin America to go for Huawei, largely because it would be not possible from a financial point of view to look for other options. The key U.S. message in Latin America, in particular when it comes to new technologies, has been about China. I spoke to a Central American diplomat who said that the Chinese were, all the United States talked about was China when they came to Latin America, and they sounded a bit like a jealous ex-boyfriend who is sort of concerned about the shift that's of course taking place. Now, I'm not here to say, China is clearly having the better strategy. I'm just saying, as an observer, I think that we currently see a tremendous shift in the region, and paradoxically, the lack of soft power and complete out of visibility is actually an advantage to China, because I would think that most Latin Americans are actually unaware of the fact that China has become the major trading partner of Latin America's main economies, such as Brazil. It's a key investor, but when you look at surveys, actually a lot of people still think that the United States is dominant. So in a weird sense, despite China being so influential, it is still used as a way to balance US influence there. Now, China clearly has a first mover advantage when it comes to 5G, and I think that will be decisive. At the same time, the US has greater innovative capacity. That will create tensions. I think we're only seeing the beginning of that right now. I think it will be a key factor in Latin American politics. I think both Beijing and Washington will increasingly pressure Latin American countries to take a stance. It will be very difficult because they also have to make decisions about the Belt and Road Initiative. Obviously, I would expect the Chinese government to connect issues like 5G, Huawei, and the BRI in the same way that the Trump administration is telling Brazil, we really will think twice about supporting Brazil for OECD membership if you decide to hire Huawei to install your 5G network. So in that sense, I think it's a very interesting region to look at to see how this plays out in the developing world. Latin America will only represent, I think, 5% of 5G users by 2025, very small, but at the same time, I think it matters a lot because there's also a battle for global standards. And I think in that sense, Chinese companies will accumulate developing countries in that sense, making it a bit easier to dominate this race, to establish global standards in this race. So I think we clearly have here a geopoliticization. Now the difficulty will be as we see the rise of tech spheres of influence, the game again that observers have played in the past, seeking to benefit from both sides, will become increasingly difficult because I think there's growing concern that there will be a separated world of two different spheres that have difficulties operating between each other. I think that leaves us with many questions about the basic assumptions we're making about globalization. I think it will make scaling technologies and developing and using knowledge and allowing knowledge to flow freely much more difficult as soon as all these things are profoundly politicized. Brazil in particular, just to finish, I think is a very interesting case to look at. It's a very pro-American government. It will seek to move closer to Washington. There's tremendous resistance when it comes to doing that because in particular agriculture, Brazilian agriculture, believes that these new technologies will be tremendously helpful to increase productivity. 5G is a key element and that, as has been mentioned here before, to leapfrog, take the next steps and actually catch up considering the many challenges that Brazil still faces. Just on a final note here, I think it's also worth pointing out that there is, of course, a race in Latin America to be the first country to develop these new technologies, and that, I think, also will be playing out in Chinese favor because, again, there isn't really a non-Chinese alternative that a developing country can opt for at this stage. So something absolutely fascinating to look to watch, and I think it's an element of this geopoliticization of digitization of technology that will be a key factor in understanding Latin American politics in the next years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A big thank you to the panelists. And now something has happened that sometimes and very regularly happens in panel discussions. Thank you very much for setting out your views. I think that has given the audience, that has given us a very comprehensive way of looking at the subjects, but we are running out of time. We have a good 14 minutes left for this panel. And I would suggest I just put one question to you, and after that, we allow the audience to interact with us, because I think that's particularly important. But the one question I wanted to ask was, because it's almost like a running theme in your interventions, I think none of you could present her or his view without at the same time at least mentioning China 3 or 4 times. So the question I have is, of course, digital technology is born out of free societies. But when we look at authoritarian societies, is it suddenly a tool that thrives particularly well in authoritarian societies? Do we have to prepare ourselves for a confrontation with authoritarian regime in whose hands digital capacities and capabilities suddenly give them, an advantage by the power of 3, 4, or 5, because once you're ready to apply it in this non-regulated way, how it is applied in authoritarian societies internally and externally, we are facing a problem. Or is it overestimating the capacities and capabilities of authoritarian regimes here? Laura.
Sure. I decidedly believe that, at least for the moment, many of these technologies, and in particular the potential of general AI applications, artificial intelligence applications at the general level, in the space of facial recognition technology, audio recognition technology, combine that with things like the social credit system that they're developing, do enable control, surveillance, control, and manipulation of populations with an ease and scale that we have not seen in the past. The digital technologies we're talking about fundamentally affect and potentially govern the information space, the information architecture. Many of these technologies, as they are changing, are going to decide what the information architecture looks like. So I think that that has implications on 2 levels. One, what do governments do with that information architecture? Do they use it to enhance their own power? Or do they use it to enable free societies? And I think what we see is that many of these technologies do enable the control, which is so critical to authoritarian power. So it enables authoritarianism, but I also think then, because we have, in particular, the Chinese Communist Party and its proxies leading the development of many of these technologies, it then enables the spread of authoritarianism, right? Because it allows for export of these technologies in a way that enables the control of populations more broadly. So I do believe that, at least at the moment, that is where we are headed. And I think that the idea of a confrontation is very much in the cards if we don't course correct sometime soon.
Okay. Somebody else?
Yeah. Again, different perspective. I think that the ways in which technology is deployed is necessarily going to reflect the existing characteristics of the state. So if we're thinking about, is it going to empower authoritarian regimes? Yes, because that's how any state that wants to exert its authority will take whatever opportunity presents itself, and this is one of them. I like to think about this particular concept using Bentham and Foucault's panopticon, and the idea of surveillance, and the idea of the state cannot see everybody all the time. Its goal is to make you think that they can see everybody all the time. And what AI and technology and all these things are doing are increasing the ability of the state to make more people think that they can see them all the time. What does that mean? It means it's almost impossible to process all of the information that is generated, all of the data that is generated by citizens every second of every day. You're talking about people going through borders, people paying taxes, it's almost impossible to process all of that information. What technology is doing is it's making it easier, making it faster, making it more feasible to do that. And what we've seen, for example, in a lot of African countries, I think about internet shutdowns and how the existence of this capacity, this ability to switch off the internet at the tap, we have seen it being used more and more and more. We had 17 internet shutdowns in 2016. And again, that is merely a reflection of what the states were already doing beforehand. So yes, but also it's more of the same. But I also wanted to add the disparity of resources between the citizen and the state is the thing that's of concern to me. That in as much as citizens might be organizing and using these new technologies to organize resistance against authoritarianism, at some point the disparity of resources becomes so great that it is impossible for citizens to overcome what the state is doing. I'm thinking about Egypt in this case, whereby a lot of citizens have used what technology was available, social media, email, whatever, listservs to organize resistances against authoritarianism. And there was a moment when it looked like this is it, this is a big transformation that's coming. But then you're talking about the biggest military in Africa, supported by the biggest military in the world, that has almost an endless amount of money that it can spend on policing its own citizens. At some point, even 50,000 teenagers with the best smartphones in the world cannot compete. That's the kind of challenge that we're seeing, especially from activists, organizers, citizens in African countries. That's the challenge that we're facing. Very quickly, one last point. Again, China, but the last big scandal to do with the internet and surveillance and policing, the last big one to break in Africa was not China, it was Israel. And the WhatsApp, where you could get a call from a WhatsApp line and you didn't even have to pick it up, but it would plant surveillance tech onto your phone, and so people could listen in. This was last week before last, could listen into your conversation. And a number of African activists were targeted by this particular bot specifically to police their behavior. We're saying China because it represents another meta-tension, meta-conversation that's happening between the US and China. But really for us who are stuck in the middle, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other.
Yeah.
I would just want to add, because I had the privilege of serving as ambassador in Israel and knowing the IT industry of the country very well, just to make a small distinction between China and Israel, not just in size, but also in quality, because in China, most of the abusive activities are state-driven, whereas in the case of Israel, you really have to see that they have a very vibrant IT industry and an enormous private sector. So that's a slightly an important different phenomenon.
All I do is my phone is being listened to.
Just to add a brief to that, I think it was interesting when we were discussing, or are discussing this in the region. I think the way that the German government has dealt with this is quite constructive. It's dealing with this in a very constructive manner, without using these sort of good against evil kind of things, where we actually, look at this in a technical way. And I think it's interesting, like to what extent do these technologies cause authoritarian phenomena? I think it's much more they may facilitate it where there is a fertile ground to do these things. Kyrene Skinner, a U.S. foreign policy advisor, was in Berlin yesterday, and she said that if the German government use Chinese technology, it would be importing authoritarianism. And I just don't see that. I think that the German government and German society is very concerned about these issues, is capable of establishing rules and norms that could possibly use the benefits that such technology provides without allowing authoritarianism to spread. And I think there was a case where the Uruguayan government bought a number of security cameras from China. There was, and the U.S. government immediately said, this will be a threat to democracy in Uruguay. And I just don't think that it's so quickly. I think and even the things like the Arab Spring, and you could even say that, the genocide in Myanmar, all these things, they may also happen without all this technology. So I think the key is really to find rules and norms, and I think in this particular case, the EU is an inspiration to developing countries because it seeks to find sort of a middle way there, and it doesn't necessarily think about all these things in purely geopolitical terms.
Thank you very much. Uri? Yeah.
Well, let me say that talking about this, it just pops up in my mind, and of course there are differences, but in the UK at the moment, there is a fierce debate developing about the facial recognition surveillance on the streets of London and elsewhere. Second point, talking China, I would say that, of course, I mentioned this easy notion of the US innovating, China replicating, but the Chinese are far beyond that. And I would say that when we would, we have to be careful about it. And let me say that in China, to my knowledge, there is on the one hand, of course, it is all about the state and the party, the dominance of the party, yet at the moment, you see a tremendous development in the educational system, where for the first time in Chinese history, students are indeed fostered to ask questions to their tutors. And that shows how they try to really pick up the positive sides of the way in which we are developing technology, etc. Third point, last but not least, I would say, talking about this whole issue you raise, and you raise it in the right fashion, I would actually withdraw again to my notion that when we talk about Europe, it is, of course, we can't do what the high-tech guys in Silicon Valley have been able to achieve. But we should not give up, and we should indeed do our utmost to use our research and development potential, to also see to it that the way in which we develop technology is really in balance with our values of a free and open society. And for that matter, I'm still a Popper-like kind of person from my academic career. Open societies are always winning the game sooner or later.
Thank you, Uri. So let's open the floor for 2 questions, looking at our clock. I can see one hand there.
I'm Paul Oquist. I'm Minister of the Presidency of Nicaragua. I have a takeaway that might suscitate some more commentary from the panel. With regard to Nanjala and Oliver, I have the feeling and the conviction that this is beyond the Cold War, that the NSA and that Anglo-Saxon club, the Five Eye intelligence, are part of the game too, as well as the Chinese and the Russians. They want all the intelligence they can get. They control all the communications they can. They control the bank transfers. They enforce the illegal sanctions with this information. A second takeaway I thought was very telling on Oliver is the situation in Latin America now, where the Chinese are offering the Belt and Road and 5G, And the U.S. has exhumed the skeleton of the Monroe Doctrine, and America First is offered in the form of the Monroe Doctrine. That's a no contest, and I think that was a very interesting thing. And I think on a positive note, although, as Nanjala mentions, the use of the internet to organize resistance to the lack of privacy or invasion of the ability to have a free society is very real, that space can be occupied too. So we look at the 16-year-olds who are on the street demanding their future with regard to climate change. European politics is changing, and it's just beginning to change, because these 16-year-olds have proven with the internet they can organize better than the adults. And in 2 years, they'll be voters. And there will be generational change, which could be very significant in politics around the world.
Thank you very much. Can we take a second question, if there is a second question from the audience? Husey? Yeah.
My name is Katja Wiese from the environmental organization Nature Fund. Thank you very much for the last quotes. I think also that we are looking all the time on the big players like China, because it's so easy to name them. But I think we really have a transition in the societies all over the world that is from hierarchy and dominant power games to a networking way of. And it's so powerful. We just experienced here in Germany, where just one YouTuber changed the discussion in a very interesting way. And I think, yes, Egypt had 50,000 young people with mobile phones and a military, but it doesn't work well. So I think we should more focus on the potential, how we can support this networking between the people, how we can assure that. And I think Europe plays a very important role. And I hope Israel and China, well, yes, they are there, but there's a huge amount of people who really thrive for a more new way of participating in the dialogue of policies. So, yes, that was my comment.
So, thank you very much for the two questions, and I would like to invite our panelists to react within 30 seconds each, if possible. Whoever would like to respond.
Well,
Uri, you can do it.
Well, on this second question, in any case, when we talk internet, when we talk cyberspace, my position is, and I'm fighting for that throughout the world at the moment, with my global commission too, is that when we talk about internet, etc., we talk actually about what is called in the diplomacy terms, the 1.5 track, which means that it is not just a matter of states and intergovernmental kinds of negotiations, but civil society is there to play its role. And civil society plus academia plus the technicians plus and especially the NGOs have to play a very important role and should not always start talking from the defensive side. They are a very powerful agent in this field, and that's the way it should go. And by now, my anxiety is actually with some countries which have actually been okay with this notion of multi-stakeholderism in the sphere of cyber, and which tend to get back again, to recur again to nearly state and sovereignty questions.
I wanted to bring another African country into the room that is currently going through a lot of these things, and that is Sudan. Because I think it highlights a lot of the complications that we're talking about in terms of power disparities, in terms of social and political change, and who gets to be in the room during these conversations. Right now we're seeing Sudan, a transitional military council that has ended nominally a 30-year regime, refusing to cede power to a civilian organization, to a civilian administration, and we're seeing hundreds and thousands, if not millions of Sudanese people across the country out in the streets every day resisting this decision. A lot of the reason why we know that this is happening is because all of these young people are on social media. And the first thing that the former regime did when the protest started is that they switched off the internet. So Sudan began the year with an internet shutdown. The overall picture that this story should tell us is, number one, that the power to switch off the internet at any one time is an immense power that a lot of authoritarian regimes are willing to exercise. And that is something that complicates the power analysis about who gets to be in the room. What can civil society do if the government is the ultimate decision maker? But the second thing is that, again, people are innovative, people are creative, people have agency. They will find a way to circumvent. How do we protect whatever spaces are left in order for citizens, civil society, all opposition parties to be able to continue to resist? And finally, that social change doesn't happen with a log frame and targets and a 2-year project cycle. People have been working on democratic issues in Sudan, as I said, for 30 years. People have been in the streets. I have friends who have been arrested, who are the same age as me, who have been arrested at least 15 times for refusing to comply with the military administration in small, daily ways. This critical mass, this thing that is happening right now, is not happening because of social media. It's one of the tools that people who have been doing this work for a long time are using in order to amplify their cause and their conversation. I say all this to again go back to the point that I made. Technology isn't going to do anything. It's people who are going to do things, who are going to determine what the space is going to look like in the next 5 or 10 years.
Thank you very much, Nanjala.
I'll just sort of pan back out from a couple of the threads in those questions, and it picks up on one of the comments from earlier. If we look at the question of geopolitics, it sort of implies looking at nation states and governments. But in fact, some of the most powerful actors on the geopolitical scene shaping these dynamics are private sector companies. So Facebook, in particular, with the number of people on its platform, but as well as Google and YouTube, the number of people using those platforms every single day, they are shaping realities. They are making decisions that govern and affect people's lives every single day. That not only, relating to things like the genocide in Myanmar, but, when Facebook has made changes at points in time to its newsfeed algorithm to differently prioritize different inputs, they've almost put out of business several newspapers that are the major newspapers in countries around the world. They are creating real-life experiments on us, on citizens, everywhere around the world. And we don't have accountability there. And we don't have transparency there. And I think this is one of the struggles, because I will say that I'm happy to get into later some of the differences, I think, between the US intelligence community and the Chinese Ministry of State Security. There's a lot of differences. But the challenge for the United States is that while these companies are built and grown out of US innovation, they are not controlled by the state. We do have a system of free markets and rule of law, and yes, we do need to be doing more to legislate and regulate and put guardrails around this. But at the end of the day, these are private companies, and what does it mean to essentially have one individual, younger than I think probably most of us on this stage, governing the decisions about the information that citizens all around the world see every single day. And I think that is an entirely new question in geopolitics that we haven't faced before.
Thank you very much. And I don't even attempt to sum up this discussion. I think it was multifaceted. I just want to say that because we are in this house, and a big thank you to the President of Costa Rica and Foreign Minister Maas, they sat through the whole discussion of the panel, and that really underscores how important the subject is also for leaders of governments and for foreign policy practitioners. I think what we know is we can't complain that we have too many or too few analog problems we are dealing with, and we know that we are entering a phase in which we are really facing a very, very serious debate about the digital dimension of the reality in which we have to conduct foreign policy and security policy. I think this panel has underscored it again, so thank you very much. A big thank you to the panelists and the President.